How long can a monumental dream withstand the weight of its own grandeur? It is a question that lingers in empty ballrooms and echoes down corridors, designed for footsteps that no longer come. Some houses are built to shelter families, others are built to outlast them, and a rare few are built as monuments to an idea so vast, so consuming, that they devour the very people who dared to imagine them. The Biltmore estate belongs to this last category. If you find value in these explorations of architecture and the lives it contained, consider subscribing. We are building toward our first 1,000, and your presence here makes this work possible. On the morning of March 6, 1914, a telegram arrived at the estate offices in Asheville, North Carolina. The message was brief. George Washington Vanderbilt II had died in Washington, D.C., following what physicians described as complications from an emergency appendectomy. He was 51 years old. The official cause was listed as heart failure, a phrase that carried medical precision but offered little in the way of explanation. He had entered the hospital days earlier for a routine procedure. He was not expected to die. The news traveled slowly through the Blue Ridge Mountains that morning. A late winter fog clung to the valleys, softening the edges of the landscape. At the estate, the great house stood silent against the gray sky, its 250 rooms holding their breath. Staff members learned of the death in stages, first the senior household officials, then the gardeners, the stable hands, the foresters who managed the 125 Yiwao acres that surrounded the chateau like a private kingdom. By afternoon, the American flags that flew over the property had been lowered to half-staff. George Vanderbilt had spent nearly 2 decades building this place. He had commissioned the finest architect in America, Richard Morris Hunt, to design a residence modeled on the chateau of the Loire Valley. He had hired Frederick Law Olmsted, the man who shaped Central Park, to sculpt the wilderness into gardens, farms, and managed forests. He had imported limestone from Indiana, marble from Italy, silks from Asia. He had filled the house with 23 Zazuzero books, a collection so vast it required its own cataloging system. He had installed electricity, indoor plumbing, mechanical refrigeration, and a heating system that pushed warm air through miles of hidden ductwork. The Biltmore was not merely a house, it was a machine for living, disguised as a palace. And yet, by the time of his death, the dream had already begun to fracture. The fortune that built this place, derived from railroads, shipping, and the relentless accumulation of Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt, had been divided and subdivided across 3 generations. George's share, while substantial, was not infinite. The annual operating costs of the estate exceeded what most American families would earn in a lifetime. The farms were meant to be self-sustaining, but they rarely turned a profit. The forestry operations, pioneering as they were, required decades to mature. The house itself demanded constant maintenance, a staff of hundreds, an endless cycle of repairs, an appetite for resources that never diminished. His widow, Edith Stuyvesant Dresser Vanderbilt, was left to manage what remained. She was 41 years old, the mother of a 12-year-old daughter named Cornelia, and the sole inheritor of a property that consumed money faster than it could be generated. The will was clear in its intentions, but vague in its provisions for the future. George had believed in the estate. He had poured his life into it. He had assumed, perhaps, that there would be more time. There was not. The funeral was held in Washington, far from the mountains he had loved. His body was later transported to the family mausoleum on Staten Island, where he was interred alongside generations of Vanderbilts. The house in Asheville received no final visit. The man who had spent years selecting every fixture, approving every detail, walking the long gallery at dusk, he never returned. In the weeks that followed, Edith began the process of assessment. Accountants arrived, lawyers filed documents. The scale of the challenge became clear. The Biltmore estate, for all its beauty, was bleeding money. The world George had built required a world that no longer existed, a world of unlimited wealth, of unchallenged aristocracy, of time moving slowly enough to allow a man to cultivate perfection. That world had been dying for years. Now its architect was gone. But this is not simply the story of a death, it is the story of what comes before, the choices, the obsessions, the quiet accumulation of decisions that lead a man to build the largest private residence in American history in a remote corner of the Appalachian Mountains. It is the story of a family that rose from nothing to dominate an era, and of the youngest son who sought something different from the relentless machinery of commerce. It is the story of a house that outlived its creator, and of the question that haunted its walls from the very beginning. How long can a dream this large survive? To understand what George Vanderbilt built in the mountains of North Carolina, one must first return to the water. The Vanderbilt fortune began not with railroads, as most assume, but with ferries, small vessels carrying passengers and cargo across New York Harbor in the early 19th century. Cornelius Vanderbilt, George's grandfather, started with a single boat at the age of 16. He was the son of a farmer, born on Staten Island in 1794, and he possessed a quality that defied easy description. Some called it ambition, others called it ruthlessness. He called it business. By the time of his death in 1877, the Commodore, as he came to be known, had amassed a fortune estimated at $100 million. Adjusted for the scale of the American economy, it remains one of the largest personal fortunes ever accumulated. He had expanded from ferries to steamships, from steamships to railroads, from railroads to an empire that touched nearly every aspect of American commerce. He was not a man of culture. He read little, traveled rarely for pleasure, and famously dismissed higher education as a waste of time. His world was numbers, leverage, and the accumulation of power. When he died, he left nearly 90% of his estate to a single heir, his eldest son, William Henry Vanderbilt. William proved a capable steward. He doubled the fortune within a decade, navigating the complexities of railroad management and the treacherous waters of Gilded Age finance. But William also understood something his father had not, that wealth, beyond a certain point, becomes a burden as much as a privilege. He watched his children grow up in mansions along Fifth Avenue, surrounded by servants and expectations. He saw them marry into European aristocracy, collect art, build summer cottages that rivaled palaces. And he recognized, perhaps too late, that the fortune was fragmenting with each generation. George Washington Vanderbilt II was born on November 14, 1862, the youngest of William's 8 children. From the beginning, he was different. Where his older brothers pursued business and sport, George gravitated toward books. Where they built yachts and racing stables, he collected manuscripts and studied languages. He was slight in build, reserved in manner, and possessed of a curiosity that ranged across art, science, agriculture, and philosophy. By his 20s, he could read in 8 languages. He had traveled extensively through Europe, spending months in the great libraries and museums of the continent. He kept detailed journals of his observations, filling pages with notes on architecture, horticulture, and the management of landed estates. His inheritance, when it came, was substantial but not limitless. William Henry Vanderbilt died in 1885, leaving George approximately $10 million, a vast sum by any ordinary measure, but modest compared to the shares received by his older brothers. George was 22 years old. He had no interest in railroads, no desire to enter the competitive arena of New York society, and no inclination to follow the well-worn paths of Vanderbilt ambition. He wanted something else. He wanted to build. The idea came to him gradually, during visits to the mountains of western North Carolina in the late 1880s. He had traveled there for his health. The region was known for its clean air and mild climate, and found himself captivated by the landscape. The Blue Ridge Mountains rose in soft folds toward the horizon, ancient and unhurried. The forests were dense with oak, hickory, and poplar. The light had a quality he had not encountered elsewhere, golden in the mornings and violet at dusk. Here, far from the noise of New York, he saw possibility. He began purchasing land in 1888, acquiring parcels quietly through agents to avoid inflating prices. By the time his intentions became known, he had assembled an estate of approximately 125,000 acres, nearly 200 square miles of mountain and valley, forest, and farmland. The scale was unprecedented. No private individual in America had ever controlled such a territory east of the Mississippi. Local residents watched with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. What could one man possibly want with so much land? George wanted to create a world. Not merely a house, but a complete and self-sustaining domain, a place where art and nature, agriculture and industry, tradition and innovation could exist in harmony. He envisioned managed forests that would demonstrate sustainable timber practices. He imagined farms that would experiment with new techniques and breeds. He dreamed of gardens that would rival those of Europe, and at the center of it all, a house worthy of the vision. He hired Richard Morris Hunt, the Dean of American Architecture, to design it. He hired Frederick Law Olmsted to shape the landscape. He assembled a team of craftsmen, engineers, and specialists, drawn from across the country and the world. Construction began in 1889. The site chosen was a plateau overlooking the French Broad River, with views stretching toward Mount Pisgah in the distance. Workers arrived by the hundreds, then by the thousands. A private railroad spur was built to transport materials. A brick factory was constructed on-site to produce the millions of bricks required. Limestone was quarried in Indiana and shipped by rail. The foundation alone required months of excavation and engineering. George visited constantly, reviewing plans, approving modifications, walking the emerging structure with Hunt and Olmsted at his side. He was not a passive patron. He debated proportions, questioned materials, suggested refinements. The house grew slowly, rising from the red clay of the Carolina mountains like something summoned from a European past. 4 stories of Indiana limestone, a roof of slate imported from England, towers and turrets and chimneys arranged in asymmetrical elegance. But elegance has a price, and by the early 1890s, the costs were mounting faster than anyone had anticipated. The numbers alone tell part of the story. 250 rooms, 35 bedrooms, 43 bathrooms, 65 fireplaces, a banquet hall with a ceiling that soared 70 feet above the floor, higher than most church naves, a library designed to hold 10,000 volumes, though George would eventually fill it with more than twice that number, a winter garden enclosed in glass, where tropical plants could flourish while snow fell on the mountains outside, an indoor swimming pool lined with white marble, a bowling alley, a gymnasium, servants' quarters sufficient to house a small village. But numbers convey magnitude without sensation. They do not capture what it felt like to stand in the entrance hall for the first time, to look up at the spiral staircase, rising 4 stories toward a ceiling painted with clouds, to feel the scale of the place press against the boundaries of comprehension. Richard Morris Hunt understood this. He had spent decades studying the great houses of Europe, measuring their proportions, analyzing the relationship between space and emotion. He knew that a room could overwhelm or embrace, intimidate or welcome, depending on choices invisible to the untrained eye. The Biltmore was designed to do all of these things in sequence, to awe visitors upon arrival, then gradually draw them into spaces of increasing intimacy. Hunt did not live to see the house completed. He died in July 1895, 4 months before the official opening, his health broken by years of relentless work. He was 70 years old and had designed more significant buildings than any American architect of his generation. The base of the Statue of Liberty, the facade of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, mansions for the Astors and the Belmonts. But he considered Biltmore his masterpiece. In his final months, too weak to travel, he reviewed drawings and photographs from his bed in Newport, making annotations in a hand that grew increasingly unsteady. George visited him there, and the two men spoke of details that remained unfinished: the placement of sculptures, the selection of fabrics, the alignment of garden paths with distant views. When Hunt died, George ordered that work continue exactly according to his plans. There would be no compromises. The vision would be honored. Frederick Law Olmsted faced his own decline. By the time construction reached its final stages, the landscape architect was suffering from what his family delicately termed nervous exhaustion, almost certainly the early stages of dementia. He had given George something unprecedented: a landscape that moved from formal gardens near the house through progressively wilder terrain until it merged imperceptibly with the native forest. The approach road alone was a masterpiece, winding 3 miles through carefully managed woodland, designed to build anticipation, to make the first glimpse of the chateau feel like a revelation rather than an arrival. But Olmsted would not remember completing it. By 1898, he had been committed to an asylum in Massachusetts, where he spent his final years unable to recognize his own work. The house opened on Christmas Eve, 1895. George had invited family and friends to celebrate the occasion, a gathering of Vanderbilts, Astors, and other luminaries of Gilded Age society. They arrived by private train, traveling through the winter landscape of the Appalachians to a station built specifically for the estate. Carriages carried them up the approach road as darkness fell, lanterns flickering against the trees. When they rounded the final curve and saw the house for the first time, lit from within by thousands of electric bulbs, several guests reportedly gasped. It was not merely large, it was impossible. A French Renaissance chateau, transported to the American wilderness, glowing against the black mountain sky. The celebration lasted weeks. There were dinners in the banquet hall, with courses prepared by chefs trained in Paris. There were hunts in the surrounding forests, guided by gamekeepers who knew every trail. There were concerts in the music room, readings in the library, games of billiards that extended past midnight. George presided over it all with quiet satisfaction, a host who preferred listening to speaking, who found more pleasure in observing his guests' reactions than in commanding their attention. He was 33 years old, unmarried, and the master of the largest private residence in America. Yet even in those first triumphant months, the weight of the enterprise was becoming apparent. The construction had cost approximately $6 million, equivalent to several hundred million in later currency. The annual operating budget required nearly $250,000 more. The farms produced food, but not profit. The forestry program, managed by Gifford Pinchot, was pioneering but decades from financial return. The house itself demanded an army of maintenance: stonemasons to repair the facade, glaziers to replace broken panes, mechanics to service the heating and electrical systems, gardeners to tend the acres of formal plantings. George had resources, but they were not infinite. The Vanderbilt fortune, vast as it remained, was no longer concentrated in a single hand. His brothers controlled larger shares. His sisters had married into families with their own demands. The railroads that had built the empire were facing competition, regulation, and diminishing returns. The world that had made such wealth possible was changing, and the estate in the mountains required a world that stayed the same. For a time, none of this seemed to matter. George continued to collect books, to improve the farms, to refine the gardens. He traveled to Europe and returned with art, furniture, tapestries. He welcomed guests and walked his forests and lived the life he had imagined. Then, in the summer of 1898, something changed. Her name was Edith Stuyvesant Dresser, and she was not what anyone expected. The Vanderbilts had married strategically for generations. alliances with other wealthy families, unions that consolidated power and preserved fortunes. Edith came from old New York lineage, but modest means. The Dressers traced their ancestry to Peter Stuyvesant, the last Dutch governor of New Amsterdam, but the family's wealth had dissipated over generations. Edith had spent much of her young adulthood in Paris, living quietly with her sisters, moving through social circles on the strength of her name rather than her bank account. She was intelligent, composed, and possessed of a practicality that George had never cultivated in himself. They met in Paris in 1896, introduced through mutual acquaintances in the expatriate community. George was 43, still unmarried, absorbed in his books and his estate. Edith was 34, considered past the conventional age for marriage, independent in a way that her era rarely permitted women to be. Their courtship unfolded slowly, through letters and visits, through conversations in drawing rooms, and walks through the Tuileries. George found in her something he had not known he lacked, a partner who could see his vision clearly and assess its costs honestly. They married on June 1, 1898, in a ceremony in Paris notable for its restraint. No grand society wedding, no parade of Vanderbilt excess. Just a quiet exchange of vows and a departure for the mountains of North Carolina. Edith arrived at Biltmore that summer as its new mistress, stepping into a role that required equal parts diplomat, administrator, and guardian. She was entering a house with 250 rooms, a staff of several hundred, and a husband whose relationship with money had always been more poetic than practical. The daily operations of the estate revealed themselves to her gradually. Each morning began with meetings, the house superintendent reporting on maintenance concerns, the head housekeeper reviewing staffing schedules, the chef presenting menus for approval. There were 80 domestic servants in the main house alone, footmen and parlor maids, laundresses and seamstresses, kitchen staff and stable hands. Each had a role precisely defined, a place in a hierarchy as elaborate as any European court. The footmen wore livery of maroon and gold. The maids followed protocols for entering rooms, for addressing guests, for handling the thousands of objects that filled the house. Nothing was accidental. Every detail had been considered. Beyond the house, the estate functioned as a small principality. The farms employed dozens of workers tending livestock, cultivating crops, maintaining the dairy that supplied the house with milk and butter. The forestry operation, now under the direction of Carl Schenk after Gifford Pinchot's departure for government service, trained young men in scientific woodland management, the first such program in America. The village of Biltmore, constructed to house estate workers, had its own church, its own school, its own social rhythms, distinct from Asheville proper. George had created not merely a residence, but a community, a self-contained world, answerable only to his vision. Yet visions require funding, and funding was becoming a persistent concern. Edith reviewed the accounts with a clarity her husband had long avoided. The annual operating costs exceeded $250,000. The farms, despite their productivity, rarely broke even. The forestry program was an investment in future decades, not present returns. The art collection, the library, the constant improvements, each represented capital flowing outward with little returning. George's inheritance, while substantial, was not regenerating. It was being consumed. She said nothing at first. There was time, she believed, to find a balance. George was working on plans to open portions of the estate to paying visitors, to sell timber and dairy products, to transform the experimental farm into a commercial enterprise. The ideas were sound in principle. Their execution proved more complicated. The isolation that made Biltmore beautiful also made it inaccessible. Asheville was growing, but it remained a small mountain town, far from the population centers that might supply a steady stream of tourists. The railroad brought visitors, but not enough. The products of the estate were exceptional, but markets were distant and competitive. In August 1900, Edith gave birth to their only child, a daughter named Cornelia. The event brought joy, but also sharpened the question of legacy. George was 57, in uncertain health, presiding over an estate that required constant infusions of capital. Cornelia would inherit this place: the house, the land, the vision, and the burden. What would be left for her? How long could the dream sustain itself against the arithmetic of maintenance and mortality? George responded by working harder, as if effort alone could bend reality to his will. He expanded the library, adding rare manuscripts and first editions. He commissioned new gardens, new outbuildings, new improvements to the farms. He traveled to Europe to acquire art and returned with crates of paintings, sculptures, and tapestries. Each acquisition was a statement of faith: faith that the estate would endure, that the money would last, that the world would continue to make room for such ambitions. But the world was shifting. The panic of 1903 rattled financial markets. Railroad stocks, the foundation of Vanderbilt wealth, fluctuated unpredictably. George's brothers were facing their own pressures, their own diminishing returns. The family fortune, once seemingly inexhaustible, was revealing its limits. And in the mountains of North Carolina, the most ambitious house in America continued to demand its tribute. How long can a monumental dream withstand the weight of its own grandeur? George Vanderbilt had spent his life avoiding the question. Now, as the new century began, the question was beginning to answer itself. The mornings at Biltmore followed a rhythm as precise as clockwork. At 6, the kitchen staff began preparing breakfast: eggs from the estate's chickens, cream from its dairy, bread baked in ovens that had been warming since before dawn. By 7, the housemaids had swept the corridors and opened the curtains in the principal rooms, allowing pale mountain light to fall across the tapestries and marble floors. At 8, George descended from his private quarters on the second floor, crossed through the oak-paneled breakfast room, and took his place at a table set with china bearing the Vanderbilt crest. He ate alone most mornings, reading correspondence or reviewing reports from the estate managers. Edith joined him when Cornelia's schedule permitted. The child had her own routines: lessons with governesses, walks in the gardens, carefully supervised encounters with the animals on the farm. To outside observers, it appeared idyllic. Magazine writers who secured invitations described the estate in terms approaching reverence. They marveled at the conservatory, with its orchids and palms, at the library with its painted ceiling depicting a sky that never clouded, at the banquet hall, where a pipe organ filled the vast space with music that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. They photographed the formal gardens, the reflecting pools, the long alley of tulip poplars that framed distant views of Mount Pisgah. They reported on the progressive farming techniques, the model forestry program, the village that provided workers with housing and education. Biltmore was presented as proof of what American wealth could achieve when guided by taste and vision. What the magazines did not report was the ledger. Each month, the estate accountants compiled figures that told a different story. The house consumed coal for heating, electricity for lighting, water for the fountains and pools and laundries. The staff required wages, uniforms, meals, housing. The gardens demanded armies of workers to plant, prune, and maintain. The farms produced abundantly, but sold modestly, their distance from major markets eroding whatever profits might have been realized. George reviewed these numbers with increasing frequency, his optimism giving way to something quieter and more strained. He began selling land. The decision came gradually, framed as strategic consolidation rather than retreat. In 1904, he sold approximately 80,000 acres to the federal government, land that would eventually become part of Pisgah National Forest. The sale brought needed capital and reduced the burden of management, but it also represented a contraction of the original vision. The domain that had once stretched across 200 square miles was shrinking. The kingdom was being parceled away. Edith watched these developments with a pragmatism her husband struggled to match. She understood that the estate, as George had conceived it, was not sustainable. The fortune that built it was finite. The income it generated was insufficient. The world beyond the mountains was changing in ways that made such private empires increasingly difficult to maintain. Income taxes, introduced in 1913, would soon claim a portion of whatever wealth remained. Inheritance taxes loomed as a future threat. The era that had permitted a single man to build a palace in the wilderness was drawing to a close. Yet George could not abandon the dream. He continued his improvements, his acquisitions, his refinements. He added books to the library, paintings to the walls, rare specimens to the gardens. He walked the grounds each afternoon, accompanied by his dogs, inspecting the work of the foresters and farmers, offering suggestions that were received as commands. The estate was his life's work, his monument, his answer to the question of what a Vanderbilt fortune might accomplish when freed from the machinery of commerce. To reduce it further was to admit that the answer had been insufficient. The tension between vision and arithmetic played out in small ways. Servants noticed that certain economies were being introduced: fewer fresh flowers in the guest rooms, longer intervals between uniform replacements, subtle reductions in the scale of entertainments. Guests who had visited in the early years remarked on changes they could not quite identify, a sense that the house was holding its breath. The great machine continued to function, but something in its rhythm had shifted. Cornelia grew up in this atmosphere of maintained appearances. She learned to ride in the estate stables, to identify plants in the gardens, to navigate the endless corridors of the house. That was her birthplace and her inheritance. She was educated by private tutors, exposed to art and music and literature, prepared for a role that grew more uncertain with each passing year. What would she inherit? A house that demanded a fortune to maintain? Land that generated expenses rather than income? A name that carried expectations she might never fulfill? George did not discuss these questions with his daughter. He preferred to show her the beauty of what he had built, the sunset views from the loggia, the smell of the forest after rain, the satisfaction of watching a well-managed farm produce its harvest. He believed, perhaps, that if she loved the place as he did, she would find a way to preserve it. Love, in his understanding, was a form of currency that might outlast the financial kind. By 1910, George's health had begun to decline. The precise nature of his ailments remained private, but those close to him noticed changes: fatigue that lingered, a reluctance to undertake the long walks he had once enjoyed, periods of withdrawal that extended for days. He was 57 years old, and the weight of his creation was pressing down upon him. The house stood as magnificent as ever, its limestone facade glowing gold in the afternoon light. But the man who built it was diminishing, and the questions he had avoided were gathering force. Then came the winter of 1914, and with it, the telegram that changed everything. The news reached Asheville on a cold March morning, carried by telegraph wires that hummed through the mountain passes. George Washington Vanderbilt II was dead. The master of Biltmore, the man who had spent a quarter-century transforming wilderness into wonder, had succumbed to complications from surgery in a Washington hospital. He was 51 years old. His daughter Cornelia was 12. His widow Edith stood alone before an inheritance that resembled a beautiful catastrophe. The will offered no surprises, but also no solutions. Edith received the estate and its contents, along with a trust intended to provide income for maintenance and operation. Cornelia would inherit upon reaching adulthood, assuming there was anything left to inherit. The document reflected George's faith in the future, a faith that the numbers no longer supported. The trust generated approximately $120,000 annually. The estate required more than twice that to operate. The mathematics were unforgiving. Each year would consume capital that could not be replaced. Edith understood this with a clarity her husband had never permitted himself. Within months of his death, she began making decisions that would have been unthinkable during his lifetime. She reduced the household staff, releasing servants who had worked at Biltmore since its opening. She closed portions of the house, shuttering rooms that would no longer be heated or maintained. She sold additional parcels of land, including thousands of acres to the federal government, for expansion of the national forest. Each sale diminished the domain George had assembled, but extended the life of what remained. The Great War brought its own disruptions. European markets collapsed. American fortunes contracted. The Vanderbilt family, once synonymous with inexhaustible wealth, faced pressures that would have seemed impossible a generation earlier. George's brothers and their heirs were selling properties, dismissing staff, retreating from the grandeur that had defined the Gilded Age. The Fifth Avenue mansions began falling to developers. The Newport cottages passed to new owners or stood empty. An era was ending, and Biltmore, isolated in its mountain sanctuary, could not escape the transformation. Edith proved a more capable manager than anyone had anticipated. She reorganized the dairy operation, establishing Biltmore Dairy Farms as a commercial enterprise that would eventually supply milk to much of western North Carolina. She expanded the forestry program, selling timber under sustainable harvesting plans that honored George's original conservation principles. She converted portions of the estate into productive farmland, generating income where before there had been only expense. The romantic vision of a self-contained aristocratic domain gave way to something more practical, a working landscape that might actually sustain itself. But the house remained a problem without solution. 250 rooms required maintenance, whether occupied or not. The roof leaked, the limestone facade weathered. The mechanical systems, revolutionary in 1895, grew obsolete and expensive to repair. Edith could slow the deterioration, but not stop it. The building consumed resources with the indifference of a natural force, demanding tribute regardless of what the accounts could bear. In 1924, Cornelia married John Francis Amherst Cecil, an Englishman of distinguished lineage and modest fortune. The wedding took place at Biltmore, in the same rooms where her parents had entertained the luminaries of the Gilded Age. It was meant to signal continuity, a new generation assuming stewardship of the dream. But Cornelia had inherited her father's sensibility without his resources. She loved the estate with an intensity that bordered on burden. She understood that preserving it might require sacrifices she was not prepared to make. The stock market crash of 1929 accelerated the crisis. What remained of Vanderbilt investments lost much of their value. The trust income declined sharply. The dairy and forestry operations, while successful, could not compensate for the collapse of financial markets. Edith, now 66 years old, faced a choice that distilled decades of struggle into a single question. Should the house be saved? And if so, at what cost? The answer came in 1930, when Biltmore Estate opened to the public for the first time. Visitors paid $2 for admission, entering through the same doors that had welcomed Astors and Roosevelts and European nobility. They walked the corridors that servants had once polished in silence. They gazed up at the ceiling of the banquet hall, posed for photographs in the Winter Garden, wandered through libraries that held George Vanderbilt's 23,000 books. The great house had become a museum of itself, a monument to an age that tourists could visit but never inhabit. Edith presented the decision as a gift to the region, an opportunity for ordinary citizens to experience beauty that had once been reserved for the privileged few. The framing was generous but incomplete. The truth was simpler and sadder. The admission fees were necessary. The house could not survive without them. The dream that George Vanderbilt had built to last forever now depended on the curiosity of strangers willing to pay for a glimpse of how the other half had once lived. Cornelia and her husband remained at the estate, occupying private quarters, while the public circulated through the showrooms below. 2 sons were born, George Henry Vanderbilt Cecil and William Amherst Vanderbilt Cecil, heirs to a legacy that grew more complicated with each passing year. The marriage strained under pressures that wealth was supposed to prevent. By 1934, Cornelia had left for Europe, eventually divorcing Cecil and spending most of her remaining years abroad. She rarely returned to the house where she was born. The weight of grandeur had claimed another generation. Edith Stuyvesant Dresser Vanderbilt died in 1958, 44 years after her husband. She had spent nearly half a century managing what he had built, making the compromises necessary to keep the house standing, the gardens tended, the vision alive in diminished form. She was 95 years old. She had outlived the Gilded Age, 2 world wars, a depression, and the transformation of American society from aristocratic aspiration to democratic consumption. The house she left behind was no longer a private residence. It was a business. Her grandsons, George and William Cecil, inherited the challenge she had spent a lifetime navigating. They divided responsibilities, George overseeing the dairy operations, William managing the house and its tourism. They modernized what could be modernized, preserved what demanded preservation, and accepted that the estate would never again be what their great-grandfather had imagined. The family quarters shrank, the public spaces expanded, the gift shops multiplied. Today, Biltmore Estate receives more than 1 million visitors annually. They come by car and tour bus, filling parking lots that sprawl where gardens once grew. They purchase tickets that cost more than a day's wage for the workers who built the house. They walk through rooms arranged to suggest habitation, past furniture roped off from touch, beneath ceilings that still soar but no longer shelter private dreams. The house has become a destination, a landmark, a brand. It sells wine from its own vineyards, merchandise from its own shops, experiences packaged for consumption. It survives. Whether survival constitutes success depends on definitions George Vanderbilt never provided. He built the house to embody an idea that wealth, properly directed, could create beauty that would endure beyond the lifetime of its creator. The beauty endures. The idea has been hollowed out, replaced by something more pragmatic and less luminous. The tourists take photographs. The gift shop sells ornaments. The banquet hall hosts corporate events. The library's 23,000 books remain, but few visitors pause long enough to read their spines. Cornelia Vanderbilt Cecil died in 1976 in England, far from the mountains where she was born. She never reconciled with the house that shaped her childhood. Her sons maintained the estate, but could not restore what had been lost. The sense of possibility, the faith that a single vision could remake a landscape, the belief that some dreams are large enough to outlast the arithmetic of their cost. How long can a monumental dream withstand the weight of its own grandeur? At Biltmore, the answer arrived slowly, across generations, in decisions made and unmade, in rooms closed and reopened, in land sold and never recovered. The house still stands, magnificent against the mountain sky. But the dream that built it has become something else, a memory preserved in amber, beautiful and unreachable, visited by strangers who will never know what it meant to live inside such ambition. The fog still gathers in the valleys on winter mornings. The light still turns golden at dusk. And the house waits, as it has waited for more than a century, for visitors who come seeking wonder and leave carrying photographs. If this story moved you, consider subscribing and sharing your thoughts on which mansion we should explore next. Thank you for walking these corridors with us. Some houses outlive their purpose. Others become their own monuments. The Biltmore stands silent, holding both possibilities in its 250 rooms, asking questions it no longer expects anyone to answer.